Hey, just a quick note to everyone coming on. We'll just give a couple minutes here. That way, everyone who's signed up is able to access the webinar, and then we'll get going with everything. Yeah, we'll give it just one more minute, and then we'll get started here. All right, so we're gonna go ahead and get started now. Welcome to today's webinar. My name is Nathan Davis, and I'll be talking about Security Distilled, Understanding Security First Principles. So just as kind of a quick synopsis, what we'll be talking about today is very focused on the concept of what is security, and taking a look at a kind of a deep dive into understanding fundamentally what security is, what it means, and how it relates to what we do as security practitioners. All right. So just a little bit about me. Got my undergraduate degree at the U.S. Military Academy at West Point. With a bachelor's in geospatial information science with a focus in systems engineering. So for me, much of my education was focused on this idea of spatial concepts. So how are things connected, and systems basically being this idea of how do I model connection. So kind of the part of the approach that I took today in talking about security. After that, I commissioned into the U.S. Army and worked within intel and security and cyber operations. So much of my career was very focused on this idea of taking data, processing it, establishing information, and sharing knowledge. So just this idea of context leading to understanding. I have a background originally working more on the physical personnel equipment side of things. I ended up pivoting to cybersecurity back a few years ago, looking for something basically just as a new challenge, essentially. After a few years in the Army, though, I decided to leave the Army, and I joined Spectre Ops, where I now do defensive cybersecurity consulting. All right. So jumping right in. So what is security? So this was a question that kind of hit me back a few months ago. And, kind of sort of from this philosophical conceptual idea, just looking at the topic of security and wondering, what is security? And I know that kind of seems like a basic question. I'm sure most of us here are security practitioners, and so it seems kind of an obvious question to say, what is security? But I realized, I didn't have a good, what I would call concrete answer or understanding of what security is, what it meant, how it worked within the space of what we do as security practitioners. And so to, kind of looking at that, I got this sense of really, security is kind of this iceberg of a topic, which kind of goes deeper than we probably tend to give it credit for. That said, I think it's still an understandable domain as long as we approach it the right way and build our foundation, from the ground up in a meaningful way, if you will. So just a little bit of history here. A couple of months ago, I was working on a maturity assessment. So one of the things that we do at SpectropOps is provide maturity assessments. And we were taking a look at this concept of, looking at an organization's security posture, assessing that. And, I really had this idea as I was talking to one of my coworkers, what is security, or rather, more specifically, what are the characteristics of successful organizations, and that being in the context of security. So essentially, what makes an organization good at security? And, with that, what's taken for granted by organizations that have good security? Because really, there's this idea that, if you're good at something, there's a chance that either you're good at it and you know it, or you're good at it and maybe you don't fully recognize why you're good at it. And, I know everyone's different, but I wanted to know, what are potentially the things that organizations take for granted? And then with that, what are the underlying security fundamentals of strong organizations? So really looking at kind of, security perspective, understanding how organizations work and what makes them effective. And that being kind of this idea both of security, but also enabling business practices. That said, where I started from, and, there might be a few more that kind of came with the same background that I came from. When I pivoted into cybersecurity, it kind of seemed like a mess of information. I know, for me at least, there was a lot of my initial learning came from things that I saw on LinkedIn, for example. And, if you took a similar route as me, you probably started off hearing a lot about things on the offensive side. So you heard about pen testing, you heard about red teaming, you heard about, why cybersecurity is so important and why, it's valuable for organizations. For me, I was in the military, so it was very focused on this idea of defending critical assets and defending the nation. But it was presented originally in the perspective, or from the perspective of, offensive security is, something that's kind of scary. And so we need to figure out how to defend against that. And so when I first started digging into it, there's all the buzzwords and the acronyms and the certifications that come with that. Learning about penetration testing, learning about red teaming, the different platforms you can use, try Hack Me, Hack the Box, learning about certifications, whether it be OSCP or CEH or something like that, the different tools. And then, of course, you move from the offensive side to the defensive side, and you start learning about that side. You got all these new acronyms that you're learning. So you got a SOC, you have tools like a SIM, your SOAR platform, you have certifications like the CISSP, host and network analysis, all these different things. And at least the way I saw it, you kind of start to recognize this idea, or I started to recognize that, well, really, we're kind of talking about maybe obfuscations or variations of computer science, because these things do depend on, at some point, the underlying computer science. So we're talking about operating systems, we're talking about networking, we're talking about programming and the automation that goes into these things, and how computer systems work, how they interact with each other. And then, of course, again, in the vein of talking about, kind of learning about things from a LinkedIn perspective or just an open source perspective, you see, after you get past the initial push of learning about just cybersecurity in general, now you start jumping into cloud computing. Maybe you start talking about industrial control systems and operational technology. So ICSOT, the most frequently, or the most recent thing is just talking about AI and how that's going to impact things, zero trust. There's, no shortage of resources that people post talking about, here's free training, go here, learn about this, learn about that. And really, it's kind of confusing if you come in from that perspective and you're trying to understand, well, okay, what is it that we're really talking about? And I'm sure everyone here is probably maybe at some point or seen a handful of people just struggling with the idea of imposter syndrome. They're not sure where to go. They don't know what to learn, or maybe what to learn next. And so I wanted to kind of take a step away from all that and look more fundamentally at the concept of what security is. So jumping back to the question of security, what is it? Fundamental understanding perspective. And so, I did some digging. I, essentially Googled the answer, trying to find what I could open source online. I looked for academic papers. I looked for journal articles. I looked for books that talked about what is security, and looked for videos, listened to podcasts, even got into kind of a back and forth with trying to just have I guess a conversation, if you will, with ChatGPT, kind of nitpicking this idea of what is security to get to an answer that I was content with, essentially. And basically, I didn't come to a point where I was content, and I got a lot of things pointing back to just the idea of the CIA triad. So the CIA triad being confidentiality, integrity, availability. Some sources went so far as to add on authenticity, utility, and possession, which in conjunction with the CIA triad. So now you have 6 things. That's the Parkerian hexad, if you're not familiar. But these things still seemed a little bit obfuscated and didn't really address, at least the way I was trying to understand it, they didn't address what security is. And I mean, even the CIA triad is more of a concept that's discussed within information security, and not so much security fundamentally, if you will. And so what I wanted to do was consider, well, security exists in a physical space, in a physical domain. And so I wanted to approach it from that sort of understanding before applying it to any sort of abstractions that we have, be it information security, cybersecurity, physical security, so on and so forth. So from there, obviously hit this point of, well, okay, where do I start? And so this is kind of where I'll, start our conversation, or rather start, this discussion, this assessment of what security is. And so I think one of the most important things to start off with is definitions. And to the best of my ability, I'll make sure that I'm covering definitions here. That way we're on the same page, talking about the same thing. And so there's some level of a shared understanding. With that, there's also assumptions. So we all have assumptions. They all influence our worldview. I will do my best to state my assumptions here. And in doing that, having these definitions and assumptions, try to establish boundaries so that this conversation, this focus doesn't bleed over into everything else. All right, so just a little bit of history. The title of this was talking about first principles. Where does first principles come? Well, back a couple thousand years ago, Aristotle posed this idea, or rather wrote about this concept. And he said, "For we do not think that we know a thing until we are acquainted with its primary conditions or first principles, and have carried our analysis as far as its simplest elements." Reframing this statement, you might say something along the lines of, we don't know security until we've analyzed it as far as its simple elements, or its most simple elements, these first principles of security. A few years later, in the terms of a couple thousand, Rene Descartes said something similar. And this one's a little bit more of a convoluted passage, but he wrote, "Now these principles must possess 2 conditions." Again, talking about first principles. "In the first place, they must be so clear and evident that the human mind, when it attentively considers them, cannot doubt their truth. In the second place, the knowledge of other things must be so dependent on them as that though the principles themselves may indeed be known apart from what depends on them, the latter cannot nevertheless be known apart from the former. It will accordingly be necessary thereafter to endeavor so to deduce from those principles the knowledge of the things that depend on them." Essentially, saying something similar with that last Aristotle quote, but basically these both establish this idea that in order to reach that point of a first principle, we have to analyze something down to this level, down to this conceptual point where it's a basic level where it can't be broken down anymore. And so with that, I'll state my first 2 assumptions here, and those being, One, that we can break security down to such a level where we can identify its first principles, its fundamental concepts. And two, that we can break security down agnostic of any qualifiers. So whether we're talking about physical, information security, cybersecurity, whatever the case is. And one last quote, promise this is the last one. So in the vein of talking about definitions, this is something that Thomas Reid, a Scottish philosopher, said a couple hundred years ago, and that is that there's no greater impediment to the advancement of knowledge than the ambiguity of words. And I'm a big fan of this quote just because it gets after this idea. And you know, if you have a similar background as mine, or at least where I was at in the military, one thing that was often said was this idea that words mean things. And for a lot of people who are new to the military, it gets a little bit tricky just because there's so much doctrine to talk about. And when you're planning military operations and planning things, it's very easy to get your words jumbled up, or at least it was for me. And so I was often told words mean things. And I mean, that essentially meant that, hey, make sure you're using the right words. That way we're talking about the same thing. I'm just a big fan of this quote, though, because it took that a step further and said, here's why. And that is, you know, essentially the advancement of knowledge. So with that, talking about security, how do we define security? That way we're all on the same page and avoiding any ambiguity of words. So starting with a definition of, you know, what is security? I'll start here. So this is the quality or state of being secure. And, you know, with this comes a secondary assumption, and that being that I can count on a particular dictionary definition to provide, you know, the definition of security. So I use the Merriam-Webster dictionary for, you know, just for due diligence. I took a look at a couple others, so the Cambridge and Oxford dictionaries. And so, you know, for semantic dispute, I guess I made sure that these are somewhat in line. That way there's kind of this common definition. So in any case, we have security is defined as the quality or state of being secure. With that, of course, you have to take a look at what's the definition of secure, because you're using secure in the definition of security. So secure similarly has to do with being free of danger, affording safety, and then being free from risk of loss. And this is kind of where my look at, you know, what's the dictionary definition say, this is kind of where I stopped. And then pivoted into more of an analytic perspective, trying to understand, okay, you know, what do these things mean? What does it mean to be free of danger, affording safety, free from risk of loss? And so in no particular order, what I kind of came up with was this idea of, you know, these different concepts. So impact, or, you know, to that end, limiting impact to something that we're trying to protect, harm or damage, and mitigating these things, again, within the context of what we're trying to protect. Defense, or the establishment of defense that ensures a known good state, referencing back that quality or that state of being secure. And then preservation, preserving something that we have in a known good state. But then with that, of course, you know, what's next? And so there's this constant kind of questioning and kind of prodding and poking deeper and deeper into this context of, or this concept of what is security. So to kind of start building a core, or a core model, if you will, I decided to build a sort of ring model. So if you're familiar with, you know, computers and, you know, the kernel, the ring model that we have there, kind of a similar approach, just because this kind of made sense to me. So here at the core, we have this idea of security, again, talking about, you know, a particular state, preventing harm. With that, you know, that's goes hand in hand with the concept of preventing harm to an asset. And I say asset here because, at least within organizations, we're generally focused on preserving the security or securing a particular asset. And then with preventing harm, we're also trying to maintain a desired quality or state. And so this is kind of the conceptual model that I've at least initially established for understanding security. With that, we'll kind of pivot into, you know, maybe a real world example of what this looks like in application. So, you know, what you see here is a nice grassy lawn, which I'm somewhat envious of because I cannot get my lawn to look quite this nice myself. But in any case, you have this nice lawn. This is the kind of thing that we would want to secure in essence, because, you know, it's a nice lawn. We want it to look nice. And so, you know, to keep it in that good condition, we have to make sure we're taking those steps to preserve that state. And so that might be things like, you know, watering it if it's too sunny out or if it's too hot out. Those are things like, you know, installing drainage and stuff like that. If it's too wet, putting up a fence if too many people are walking on it, you know, events, or excuse me, steps like that you would take to prevent harm and, protect its state that it's in, for whatever your purpose is. In this case, generally just enjoying a nice green lawn. Of course, the same is true of any asset that you want to protect. You have to take measures to secure it, to maintain its state, and to, make sure that, there's not harm occurring or coming to it, if you will. With that, pivoting just a little bit here, conceptually, let's take a look at security as a spectrum, essentially. So if you will, consider security to be kind of like temperature. And what I want to pose here is this idea that there's this point of absolute security. And this is much more focused on a conceptual understanding as opposed to an absolute quantifiable understanding, if you will. So security having a point of absolution, similar to temperature. And when I say, temperature, this idea of absolute zero, where theoretically molecular motion ceases, and not to get into debate about, energy or quantum mechanics, but this point of, the 0 point. So with security, that point of absolution is this point where, nothing can do anything. There's no harm that can come to it. The state is preserved, so on and so forth. So the kind of thing that, consider Pandora's box, for example. If you're trying to keep everyone out from touching Pandora's box, you don't want anything opening up the box and, unleashing chaos on the world and stuff like that. You want to have this point of absolute security where nothing can touch it, nothing can bring harm. The state is preserved, in that state being this idea that the box stays shut, nobody can get to it, so on and so forth. And so that's this point of absolute security. Again, I recognize that's not necessarily a realistic point, but conceptually, theoretically, we'll assume there's a state of absolute security. On the other end, of course, a complete lack of security is this idea where anything and everything can cause some sort of harm to the particular asset that we're interested in protecting. Now, all that said, as security practitioners, what we generally focus on is, getting close to this point of absolute security, or, as close as we can get, obviously within the context of, operations. And so, all of us who are security practitioners, we do exist within this space where we are supporting operations. We are supporting the business, because obviously the business drives, the business drives everything. So money drives the business drives what we're doing on a daily basis. Security is supposed to support that. And, I would say it's probably safe to say you're not going to find a business that starts first and foremost with the idea of, okay, how are we going to secure things? Now, it starts with this idea of what do we want to do? And then security comes in probably more often than not as an afterthought when they realize, oh, shoot, we need security. So again, thinking back on the idea of absolute security, that's no good in the context of operations, simply because, we need to work with assets, we need to work with documents, with information, with systems. And so with that, we need access. And that's kind of our segue into discussing our fundamentals here. So first, talking about access, this is kind of our dividing line now into our more in-depth analysis. And so just to kind of kick things off here, I will continue to reference just that spectrum of security with that absolute security. And then, not so much the other side, but talking about absolute security to kind of start each one of these off. So maximum security so that maximized security is kind of that point of absolute security. At this end, there's this idea of no access. Of course, we obviously know that within operations, people need to have access. Because obviously that's how business is done. And so security has to be optimized in some way, shape, or form. And so, if we're coming in as security practitioners, whether it's a new organization or maybe it's an old organization, but we want to start with this idea of making sure that access is properly distributed. And so with that, of course, comes this idea of making sure that access is granted to who needs access, and it's granted when access is required by these individuals. And then, of course, in an ideal world, the concept is we grant access, but then kind of revert to no access outside of whatever the requirement window is. So when operations cease, if they do cease, access cuts off, and essentially that leaves us in a more secure state. Of course, operations are always trying to optimize their side of the business. And so that might mean that operations become continuous. That might be the default. Operations may cease only for small periods of time. or, operations simply just shift at specified times. And so then it's a continuous operations. And so security has to continue figuring out, okay, how do I do this? And so the question then being, how do we optimize security and operations? And of course, as a consultant, I'll be the first to tell you it depends. That said, what we'll dig into here is the ways that we can think about this. That way, what we're doing is, in effect, optimizing, the way security exists within the operation space. And so what we'll do here is kind of build this idea of a wall. So what I have right here is that core definition that we talked about, that being preventing harm to an asset. And, what we just talked about there was access. So in order to leverage access, we need to extend some level of trust. And so this is going to be our first building block, which is, like I said, trust. So on that point of absolution, there's this idea that, nobody is trusted. But of course, in operations, that's obviously not a functional methodology. So trust has to be extended, and, things need to be considered when granting that trust. And so those are things such as, who needs access? What do they need access to? When do they need access? What are the impacts if access is wrongly granted to someone? What happens if someone abuses that access? And so, with that comes this idea of not just trust, but trust actions that are given to individuals in order to complete, whatever it is that they're doing within the scope of the business. And these trust actions are what I'll call access and modification. And bear with me, because I realize it's kind of a little bit confusing, because I just talked about access leading to trust, and now I'm talking about access being a trust action. But if you're familiar with at least, the idea of like an operating system, you've probably seen, the read, write, create, delete permissions. Well, this is kind of that same model that I'll use. So access being that simple read, I can look at something, I can access something, and it kind of ends there. And with that, there's also this idea of modification. So that being your write, create, delete, and just to kind of expand on that just a little bit. So modification being a very basic form of the word, because, if you're talking about writing, you're modifying something that exists. And then, of course, if you're talking about deleting or creating, that's generating something that didn't previously exist or destroying something that does exist. In any case, here we have our first building block, trust, which is performed through trust actions, which include access and modification. Now, that's great. We've established the first one. We can extend trust, but we can't always see trust, which means that we have to verify trust. And this is ultimately accomplished through accountability, which is our complementary building block to trust. So back again to our spectrum of security at that point of absolution, secure would imply that everything is accounted for, which of course requires either verification or extension of trust in lieu of verification. But in any case, to do this, to have accountability, there's a couple of things that we have to be able to ask ourselves and answer. So those things are essentially boiled down to these 4 ideas of identification. What is it? What is this thing that we're supposed to be securing? Going back to the previous example, we'll use Pandora's box as our what. Location, where is it? That's going to be wherever we decide that we want to secure it to prevent anybody from accessing it whatsoever. In the theory of absolute security, that's probably somewhere buried deep underground that no one can ever access for some reason. Again, maybe that one's not quite as realistic, but here we have our location. We know where it is. Quantity, how much of it do we have? And I realize that one can sometimes go hand in hand with what it is, especially if we're only talking about one thing. But, quantity kind of extends into that idea of we need to make sure we're protecting all of the assets that we have, and then purpose. And this being, why do we have it? And that really also translates, at least in the context of operations, figuring out, okay, what needs to be secured and, what's most important, essentially. So if we're talking about purpose, we're talking about this idea of, everything has a purpose. With that, probably everything has some level of priority for which we are securing things. That said, this is kind of our second building block, or rather, this is our second building block, accountability, constituted by identification, location, quantity, and purpose. And this complements trust by ensuring that those assets for which we wish to prevent harm are properly accounted for. And I would say at this point, we have our bases mostly covered. But the problem that I see here, at least, when I was taking a look at this is, these two right here, trust and accountability, account more so for those things that we have some ability to control in our organization. We're able to extend that trust and find ways to account for that. Though to be clear, that's not to say that trust and accountability can't be lost or abused, because obviously we see things like that, especially if you're talking about like an Active Directory environment and too many permissions, or people being put in the wrong group, stuff like that. And of course, accountability can also get a little bit dicey if we're talking about asset management. So I realize there's no perfection here. That said, we can still use these to build our concept and understanding of security. But kind of back to what I was saying, though, these exist kind of in this vacuum of our control. And so we have to account for, those things that I would say are not necessarily within our control. And so, of course, the question is, well, what's missing? What do we need to mitigate that's not being addressed here? And that led me to this idea of external threats. So external threats being, those threats that basically decide that, hey, they want to cause some sort of harm in some way, shape, or form. And so, they're going to seek to do that in some way, again, some way, shape, or form. Of course, this happens in a couple of different ways. And before I dig into that, I'll mention, again, talking about the spectrum, secure is nothing can cause harm. So theoretically, in that fully secure state, an external threat is no concern. That said, we do live in the real world. We live in an environment where external threats are constantly bothering us, and we're generally at risk of some sort of threat. And so these threats come in two different forms, those being active and passive. And those kind of being in this idea of an active threat is an individual decides that they want to cause some harm on you, and they decide, or let's take a look at a bank. An individual decides that they want to rob a bank. They can go in, they can break something, they can steal something, they can, if they're, particularly motivated or well-equipped, be able to take something from that bank. That's a kinetic activity. That's a physical attack, an active threat, if you will. On the other side, there's something that's a little bit more passive. So that being something like environmental activity. So weather, even time, because everything essentially wears away with time. But those being those ideas of external threat, we're talking now about the deterrence that we require to be able to deal with those. And deterrence similarly comes in both active and passive variations. So active being, if you consider a roving security guard who's walking around along a perimeter, looking for someone who's trying to bypass that perimeter, they're actively going to put a stop to that individual. Maybe they might check them for credentials, ask them to leave, chase them down if they try to breach the perimeter, something like that. And then passive being something a little bit more along the lines of, something that's not going to actively respond. And I think of something kind of along the lines of, if I have a fence, that's not actively going to respond to someone trying to jump over it, but it is a sort of passive deterrence to someone who's trying to break in and maybe steal something. So here we have, our building blocks of deterrent within deterrence. We have active and passive deterrence. And this kind of, this is our third and final really building block that we have within this conceptual understanding of security. And like I said, we do this to account for those threats that exist outside of our control. Again, be it, weather or a criminal, potentially even an unknowing user. All right. And so there we have it. We have security. Security is defined or bounded as preventing harm to an asset. So that core concept. And we know this means state preservation and or defense against changes to the state. Of course, in the context of operations, access must be granted, and therefore trust must be extended where necessary to perform operations. This comes in the form of trust actions, and these include access and modification, which fundamentally account for, the variations of actions that we can take, like I mentioned, thinking along the lines of read, write, create, delete. With that, assets must also be monitored. However, for the purpose of maintaining state awareness, this is done by ensuring that we have that identification, that location, quantity, and purpose, making sure these are known, because without these, we can't achieve that state of accountability. And so we can't say necessarily that the state is preserved. Finally, recognizing that we don't live and operate in a vacuum, we must also account for ways to prevent additional threats, whether passive or active, and this is deterrence. Deterrence comes in the forms of passive and active deterrence and closes the loop on the fundamental concepts of security. With that, so now that we've kind of talked about security, it really wouldn't be a full SpectraOps conversation if I wasn't also going to talk about how our adversaries work, how they, think, how they do things. And so just giving a little bit of attention there, this is how we'll extend these fundamental concepts of security a little bit farther and talk about the adversary side. So looking first at trust, this is something that attackers abuse. Attackers abuse trust in order to access things, in order to change things, create or remove things. You can see this in examples like account takeover or something like that, privilege escalation. With accountability, attackers exploit accountability and take advantage of our own ability or inability to identify what we have. So, maybe that's endpoints or where all of those things are located or how many we're supposed to have and why we have them. And then finally, deterrence. So this is a big one because if an attacker is able to bypass both our active and passive deterrence, that really allows them to essentially get in, grab their stuff, cause some sort of harm, and get out with as little pain as possible. With that, there may be more to this, and I do challenge you to consider the ways that you see all of this playing out in your own experience. And of course, this talk isn't meant to be the be all end all. It's really more of what I consider a foundational work of research that is meant to be improved upon, countered if you have a counter, and adapted for the betterment of security practitioners everywhere. Because that's really where I'm focused, is improving security as an industry, across the board. And so with that, by now, I hope I've been able to provide you with a little bit of a lens through which you can look at security agnostic of any particular qualifiers that, there might be. Again, those physical, information, cyber, and, I think I mentioned this before, but this wasn't supposed to be necessarily a deep dive so much as a holistic look at what is security and establishing a deeper understanding of security. And with that, I challenge you to consider how even the different tools, the different practices, what you're doing in your organization, how that particularly aligns or maybe doesn't align with the fundamentals. And then, of course, with that, thinking through the idea of, are these fundamentals right? Is there something that, maybe I missed? And because I'll acknowledge that what I presented here is very much based on my own research. It's based on my observations, what I've experienced, what I've put into practice, what I've read. And so I recognize that, there may be opportunity where I may have made a mistake by omission or failure to account for a first principle. So if you happen to come up with, what that other first principle is, or you find that in your own practice, I would definitely love to hear your perspective and see how you kind of analyze through that problem set and break it down and see how it kind of fits into this idea of security. And lastly, my final challenge is just to remember that the world in which we work as security practitioners is security first, and that's regardless of any qualifiers, whether it's, again, cyber, information, physical. And, I will certainly admit that working within cybersecurity is a fascinating place to work. And the more I dig into it, the more I develop an appreciation for computer science, particularly just seeing how things operate under the hood, understanding operating systems and networks. It is absolutely fascinating. But that is, more the cyber part of it as opposed to necessarily the security part. And so I would pose that it's difficult to practice something fully without understanding the fundamentals, and here, those fundamentals being security. So with that, that concludes my talk. I appreciate everyone coming out today and listening to some of the research that I've been working on for quite a while now. It's definitely been a challenge working through this concept and trying to present this idea of what I would pose are the fundamentals of security, because obviously that's kind of sticky water, or that's a sticky place to be in. And, just kind of as a final shout out, I do want to say a lot of appreciation for some of my coworkers here at SpectraOps, Brandon Scullion, Russell Van Toyle. Both of them definitely played a significant part in helping me kind of shape this concept and this idea. And so with that, I'll, I guess, open it up if there's questions or comments, or, if you want to get going, feel free to do that too. So thank you again for stopping by.